Welcome to episode 33 of The Chess Angle. My name is Neil. I am the founder and director of the Long Island Chess Club in New York. This podcast is all about chess, tournament play, and improvement at the amateur and club level. Be sure to follow us on Twitter. Our handle is @TheChessAngle. I do have to apologize up front. I am fighting a little bit of a cold. It's not COVID or anything like that. Had all the tests. I had a strep test, COVID test. Everything was negative, so that's good. But I'm definitely fighting some type of cold. So in addition to dealing with my Long Island accent, as always, you may hear a little bit of a raspy voice. But I apologize for that. And as they say, onward and forward. This podcast is sponsored by Chessable. I know many of you are already using Chessable, but for those who haven't yet, their courses are phenomenal. Chessable uses science-backed learning and the concept of spaced repetition to increase retention and ensure that you're learning the material. Check out chessable.com today. Now, let's get to the content. This episode is going to be a little bit different in that I'm going to step away from the game itself and talk about the tournament environment and specifically dealing with an opponent who is exhibiting distracting behavior, because that can be an issue. And I know many of you are now getting into tournaments. We have a lot of adult improvers listening who are kind of just getting into tournaments. And this is something you're going to have to deal with. And the reason I think it's important to talk about is that you could be working on your chess skill and your chess theory and all your knowledge. But if you're thrown off because your opponent is behaving in a certain way or is trying to distract you, that can throw you off and all that studying won't matter. You don't want to lose a game simply because you were distracted by your opponent. You know, that's a far cry from losing, say, an end game because you didn't know the theory. So it's important that we talk about it. And the focus is going to be mainly on in-person or OTB or over-the-board tournaments. Before we get into that, I do want to address distracting behavior online because that's actually pretty easy to deal with, in my opinion. For online games, if you have an opponent who's distracting you, who's just, making inappropriate comments, let's say, or is disconnecting, things like that, there are steps you can do to deal with that. Now, many of you may know this, but if not, you can report the person to the server. You can block that person. Another thing that I do that I highly recommend is turning the chat off, because this way they won't do things like put GG, like good game, if they have like a winning move. Like what some players will do, they'll make a move that's clearly winning, and then they'll type in something like GG, good game, or nice game, which is kind of a cheesy move. And there are worse things that they can say beyond that. You all know what I'm talking about. So what I do when I play online, I simply turn the chat off. Most of the servers have that as some type of privacy function. And then if I suspect that someone's cheating or if they're just being annoying in general, I just block the person and report them so you don't have to deal with it again. So for the online servers, as I said, they have things in place that can really minimize or practically eliminate that, so it's much easier to deal with. However, for in-person tournaments, things get a lot tricky, and you're also sitting there for several hours at a time, whereas most of us online are playing blitz games, maybe 5-minute games. So even if you don't block the person and you play someone like that, whoop-de-doo, you play the game and then it's over and then you move on to the next game. Obviously, in a major over-the-board tournament with classical time controls, that's not possible. And so what I'm going to do today, I'm going to review some of the most distracting and annoying behaviors that I've seen as a TD, that I've faced myself as a player, and some suggestions to handle it and what you can do about it. Now, one of the reasons I started my own club was because the TD at the local club I was playing at did not handle distracting behavior very well. If someone was doing something he or she wasn't supposed to, he didn't really step in. And I was the victim of this, more than once. And it got to a point where I said, I'm just not dealing with this anymore. So I mentioned the time control was another issue with that club, but this was something else. And unfortunately, this is something you're going to face and you have to deal with. Now, I don't want this episode to sound like I'm being a negative Nelly. It's a fun game. It's a great game. Tournaments are awesome. And what I'm saying really is for maybe 10 to 15% of your games. It could be more or less depending on whether it's a major tournament or your local club. We'll get into that. But it's only a small portion of your games, but it's enough of your games that it could have an effect on your rating. All right. You don't want to lose a game for something that had nothing to do with what was happening on the board. You don't want to lose a game because of distracting behavior. And so I think it's important that we talk about it. Now, first and foremost, a lot of people may not know this simply because a lot of people don't own the rule book, which you really should have. Most players do not have a rule book unless they're a TD themselves. All right. But I strongly suggest you purchase one. It's nice to have. And the reason I'm mentioning it is that it is actually against the rules to distract your opponent. It explicitly states that in the rule book. Here's what it says. This is Rule 20G. Annoying behavior prohibited. It is forbidden to distract or annoy the opponent in any manner whatsoever. A director, upon a complaint by the opponent, has discretion to determine whether any particular behavior is in violation of this rule and to impose penalties. All right, so simply put, you're not allowed to distract your opponent. And if this happens to you, and you're going to hear me repeat this throughout this episode, you need to step in and do something about it. Don't suffer in silence. I know a lot of people, they don't like confrontation. They don't want to ruin the flow of their game. They don't want to make a scene. They feel strange if the distracting behavior is done by someone who's, let's say, a kid, like your opponent is like an 8-year-old, or if your opponent is, let's say, someone much older. But the truth is, you shouldn't have to suffer in silence. When that behavior happens, you should either say something to the opponent, and in many cases that might be enough, or if that doesn't work, you have the right, and you should, pause your clock and call over a TD and explain what's going on. And hopefully it'll be the type of TD who's really going to step in and do something. Because usually what will happen is when you call the TD over, that person will get a warning first. Most of the time, that should correct the problem. I would say 80% of the time that should do it, because the fact that a TD came over and the person got embarrassed a little bit, that's usually enough to realize, okay, I can't do this. But if the behavior continues, then the TD can assess a penalty. He can give you 2 minutes added to your clock, something like that, if it's a sudden death time control. And then if it continues, the TD can step in even further. Now, here's how I would handle it, all right, which I think is correct and is in the spirit of the rule book. If someone reports distracting behavior, all right, I would first issue a warning. If it didn't happen again, then I would assess a penalty, 2 minutes to the opponent, all right? And then if it continues at that point, you're done. I'm just going to adjudicate the game. All right, I mean, how many chances are you going to give the person? If you give them a warning and then you add time to his opponent's clock, which is essentially like 2 penalties, so to speak, that should be enough. Usually it doesn't get to the point where you're adjudicating the game. Usually once you get into like time penalties and stuff, the problem's handled. But the point I'm trying to make is that as a player, you have the right to pause your clock and call over a TD if you're not able to resolve it with your opponent directly. But you should never just sit there and suffer in silence and then lose the game. Because what happens is, and I hear this all the time, and I'm not just talking about my club, I'm talking about chess tournaments in general, where you lose the game and it's like, oh, he was distracting me, or he was doing this, or, he was talking when he shouldn't have, or he kept, he distracted me and I lost the game. But meanwhile, did you say something? Well, no, I didn't say anything. Okay. I'm not saying it's your fault and you deserve to lose, but you should not have to be subject to that. You're paying a lot of money for these entry fees, especially at the major events. If your opponent is distracting you, you need to step in and say something. And I will say this as a TD, because in this episode, I'm wearing two hats. I'm putting on my TD hat and my player hat. Once a result is reported, okay, once you mark that score on the pairing sheet, there's really nothing we can do. I mean, unless it was like a cheating accusation and you have something like recorded, you know what I'm saying? It'd have to be something like really egregious. But as far as just standard distracting behavior, and I'll give you some examples. Once you report the score, okay, once there is a reported score and there's a result, we really can't do anything. Like, you can't mark the score and say, well, he was fidgeting the whole time. Or, you can't mark the score and say, well, he kept offering me, draws over and over, repeated draw offers, even though I said no and it was distracting me. Too bad, so sad. All right. That's the expression. Too bad, so sad. We want to help you as TDs, but like I said, once you report the result, there's really not much we can do. That's why you need to nip it in the bud and tell us as it's happening, because then we can step in. Now let's talk about some of these behaviors. Now, some of this, as I explain it, as you're listening to it, it might almost sound funny, some of these, but when you're actually dealing with it, it can be annoying. Some of these may be inadvertent. Some of them are more obnoxious. And of course, what one person finds distracting, someone else may not. But let me go over like the most common ones and how I usually handle it, a la New York style, and some things you can do. I mean, I'm your typical, New Yorker. I'm nice, I'm respectful, but, if you push me with something, I'm going to push back. I wouldn't do that initially, but, if you start in, I'm not just going to sit there. And that's really, what your attitude should be. I don't like to be confrontational either, but I'm going to go back to my earlier point, which is that it's not fair that you should have to suffer through this distracting behavior. Now, I want to say something up front. The stereotype, so to speak, is that most of this behavior comes from kids, right? Opponents who are, say, under 10 or under 12, whatever it is, under 15, something like that, right? That's sort of the typical stereotype, right? Oh, these kids, they're distracting, they fidget. Now, while that can be true, I can tell you in my experience, there are many adults who are just as bad or worse. Now, I don't mind playing kids, although I'm going more by the ones who show up to my club. They're great kids, but I can imagine if you go to a major tournament and, out of, let's say, 7 rounds, you're playing, 5 of them who are kids and they're distracting, I kind of get that. And one of the reasons I don't play in the major tournaments anymore is because I hear a lot of these reports about distracting behavior from kids and adults. Now, I don't know if it's just that these major tournaments just attracts that kind of crowd, or, I'm not sure what it is, but I mean, number one, if you don't like playing children as your opponent, you might want to reconsider going to these major tournaments, because from what I'm hearing, 80% of the participants are young kids. I mean, who was telling me? Was it Tim? I think it was Tim. He went to a major tournament recently, one of the CCA, the Continental Chess Association. For those of you who are listening outside of the United States, they run most of the major tournaments in this country, in the US. And he was telling me it was like a 7 or 8 round tournament, something like that. His oldest opponent was 17. Okay. His oldest was 17, but that's what you're looking at. And then we get into, should there be tournaments for adults only, like 21 and over? Probably a good idea, or 18 and over, but I don't really think they're going to do that because they might lose money because most of the participants are kids, but it's something to think about. I much prefer playing at the club level than at these major tournaments. Part of it is my schedule, family, working full time, graduate school right now. I, got a lot on my plate, all things I love, but I just can't torch an entire weekend to play chess, nor will I have the mental focus to handle all those games at one shot. So it would be nothing but a ratings dump for me, because I just wouldn't play well, because I cannot play that much chess and just devote a whole weekend to it at this point right now in my life. Maybe down the road, it's something I'll get back into, but it's not for me. I'm good with my weekly game at the club. That's plenty for me right now. And then whatever studying and online play I do, that's fine. Others prefer the weekend format, but again, you're playing a lot of chess in a short amount of time. So it's hard to begin with to maintain that type of focus for, 4 or 5 games or 6 or 7 games over the course of a weekend. And then if you're dealing with distracting behavior on top of that, it can be very difficult. And the other reason I don't play in these major tournaments is if you have a long, drawn out game, it's just a tough game and it's down to the wire, and bam, you make that one little blunder in the end game and then you lose. Like, to just recover from that, because what happens is these games are relatively back to back. So if you're down to the wire, you mean to tell me in like 15 to 20 minutes, you're going to be able to recover from that, shake off that loss and go right into another game? Whereas for your weekly club game, whether you won or whether you lost, let's say you had a really bad night, you shake it off, you come back in a week, you're nice and fresh. Just saying, that's my opinion. And the reason I bring up my whole theory about these weekend tournaments is, on top of the stress of playing all weekend and the amount of mental energy that's required, if you're dealing with distracting behavior on top of that, it can be very, very tough. All right. So now let's talk about some of these specific behaviors, how I handle it, what I recommend you do. Let's get to it. So one of the things I'm seeing a lot lately is non-resigning. Now, I'm cheating a little bit throwing that one in here because technically that's not against the rules, and it's not really distracting in the sense that, your opponent's allowed to not resign. They can play on. So I'm doing this one first because this is more of a nuisance when it comes to distracting behavior. But what I'm noticing, non-resigning is like a thing now. Now, I know some people have that philosophy and, no one ever lost by resigning. But what I'm finding now, even for myself in my own games, even like higher rated, experienced tournament players are not resigning. So I don't know. Is that like a thing? Is there like some post? Is there something like floating around, I don't know, Twitter or the internet, like, no one resigned anymore? Because I didn't get the memo. Now, there's non-resigning and there's non-resigning. If I'm down a piece against, a much stronger player, well, I'm probably just going to call it a day. All right. But if I'm down material against a much lower rated player, I'm going to keep going, especially if the queens are on the board. So it's context dependent, but I'm seeing players rated like 17, 18, 1900 who are down significant material with no compensation, who are just not resigning. So I guess that's a thing now. But the way to deal with non-resigners, okay, because you really can't report that, because again, it's more of a nuisance. That's not illegal. You're allowed to keep going until you get mated. The way to deal with it is do not get frustrated, because you might win the guy's queen or you might win a piece. They have no compensation. And you're like really? Because what happens is you feel that they're insulting your ego. Let's face it. That's what it is. So I win your piece or your queen and you don't resign. It's almost like you're saying to me, you think I'm so awful that even though I'm up a piece, I'm going to screw up and you're still going to win. Like, that's what you think of me. You don't believe that I can win the game. And you know what? Just keep playing. Don't let it get to you. Don't allow counterplay. And so the way to handle non-resigners is to just not get frustrated and to expect it. Like, I almost expect it now. It used to be you won a piece or something and people would resign. It still happens. But non-resigning, apparently in 2022, that's like a thing now. So when you're facing that, just deal with it, just play, and don't get frustrated. All right. And you'll be fine. You're just going to have to wait them out. Now, another thing I see, I'm kind of jump around here, are the non-scorekeepers, which can be annoying. Now, a couple of things about keeping score. All right. The rule is like if you have a sudden death time control, okay, both players have to keep score unless either player goes below 5 minutes. So for example, as soon as one player has less than 5 minutes on his clock, then both players can stop keeping score. But just keep in mind, if you want to claim a draw by threefold repetition, you have to have a complete score sheet to support that. All right, so that could be a problem down the road. But both players are required to keep score. If you see your opponent's not keeping score, you should pause the clock and get a TD. The reason it bothers me is not so much that he doesn't have a complete score sheet, but that he has it easier, right? Because he's not keeping score. He's just playing. It's not fair that I am keeping score. So if you see someone who's not keeping score, you should pause the clock and report that. All right, something else, and this is more on the obnoxious side, are repeated draw offers. Okay, those are against the rules. You're not allowed to do that. And repeated draw offers usually happen when the person's losing and he's just trying to get away with half a point. So it's, I offer a draw, I offer a draw, I offer a draw, right? Like every 3 moves. Do not put up with that. Pause the clock and say, tell your opponent, you can't keep offering a draw. You need to stop. I'm not taking a draw. And if they keep doing it, you have to get a TD over. All right. Because as I said, if you just deal with that and then you lose the game and that score is reported, well, guess what? Now you can't report that because the game's over. You need to handle this stuff, as it happens. All right. Another big one is finger tapping, right? Tap, tap, tap. I don't know if I'm tapping my fingers on the desk. I don't know if the mic's picking it up or not, but tap, 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 tap. You ever play with one of these, like a little tap dancer? Tap, tap, tap. Stop tapping your fingers, dude. Okay. We have a couple of tappers at the Long Island Chess Club, but I know in some of the major tournaments, there are some tappers as well. Usually if you tell them to stop, they will, but it just amazes me that people even do that in the first place. Now, another thing is the fidgeting. All right. This is an issue mostly with kids, but it can be extremely distracting where they just can't sit still. They stand up, they squirm, they fidget, and this is tough to deal with because I get it. You're dealing with a child. So it's like, you don't want to seem like, like a bully or like you're telling a child what to do. But if it's distracting, just say in a very respectful way, can you please sit still? I would appreciate it. Many times that'll work. Some of them will be a little embarrassed, realize that what they're doing is wrong, and they'll stop, and that's the end of it. But then some of them will look at it as a challenge. It's almost like a defiance thing. So if you're politely asking your opponent who's a child to stop doing that and they still do it, again, call the TD over, because so many people, they won't say something because they don't want to make a scene, but then they end up losing the game. And like I said, that's not fair to you. So there's absolutely nothing wrong with just respectfully saying, can you please sit still? I would appreciate it. And if that doesn't work, call the TD over. All right. Because like I said, once you report the score, all right, you know what I'm going to say? There's really not much, of anything that we can do. Now, I had a situation with a child. I mentioned this in the episode about catching a chess cheater. It's like episode 2 or 3, something like that, where he had a scorebook. He was keeping score. Now, with these scorebooks, you have your old games in it, which I question whether those should be allowed. But anyway, he was flipping through his scorebook to look at previous games because I guess we were playing an opening that was similar to something you did before. Now, you can't do that. That's sort of like cheating. And I looked at him and I'm like, are you, looking through your scorebook? And the gentleman next to me saw this and he jumped in. He was like, yeah, you can't do that. Now, what I should have done, okay, this was many, many years ago in my 20s. I was fairly new to tournaments. I didn't have any TD experience. What I should have done was pause the clock and just, call the TD over, and it should have been handled that way. But instead, this child was obviously so, thrown off. It was like a deer in the headlights. He knew he was wrong. He ended up blundering the game away. But what I would have done now, if I see something like that now, I would have just paused the clock and called the TD over and been like, he's thumbing through his book. You can't do that. that's the proper way to handle it. But I get it, because when you're dealing with a child opponent, it's like, do I make a scene? And then his parents are going to come over. So you might think, all right, it's just easier if I just kind of suffer in silence. But I do not recommend doing that. Another thing you see are players who start to analyze their game and who start to talk loudly in the tournament hall. Now, as with distracting behavior, that is in the rule book. All right, it says it. It says you are not allowed to analyze your game in the tournament hall. That's a USCF rule. What they should do is leave the room and go to the Skittles room. Now, that is a nice thing about the major tournaments as opposed to the local clubs. Most of the major events have a separate Skittles room. All right, so there's no excuse for them to do that. Local clubs tend not to have a separate room, but if you see players talking after their game is done, just say, guys, do you mind, can you just, take it to the Skittles room? I'd appreciate it. And most of the time they will. But, if you're sitting next to someone, two players, they finish and they start analyzing and you're in a really tough position, you shouldn't have to put up with that. So just ask them to kindly go to the Skittles room. All right. But again, you should be aware that technically that is a violation of the USCF rules. It's in the rule book. You are not allowed to analyze your games in the tournament hall. That is why Skittles rooms exist. All right. Another little kind of pet peeve thing for me, maybe this is like my OCD or something, but I do not like when someone has a paper score sheet, okay, because I know sometimes people keep score electronically. They'll put the score sheet so that part of the score sheet is like covering the corner of the board. No. Move your score sheet, dude, okay? I don't know what it is. Like I said, maybe it's an OCD thing, but that bothers me. It's like a board vision thing. But I see this a lot where they'll place their score sheet down and they're covering like a good portion of the corner of the board, and it bothers me. So I'll ask them to move it. But if you see that and it bothers you, you should do the same. That's just my own little kind of quirk. I find that to be a big pet peeve. Maybe if you see that, it won't bother you, but you should not be covering the board with any part of your score sheet. Okay, so I would say something. Another thing, this is very, very obnoxious, are the incessant piece adjusters, where like every 5 seconds I adjust. All right, now the rule is, just to kind of go through this from the beginning, it's touch move. Okay, the clock has nothing to do with it. If you touch a piece and it can be legally moved, you have to move it. Period. End of discussion. However, if you just want to adjust a piece, you have to say, I adjust, or jawdoob, which means I adjust before moving it. All right. And then it's okay. But you're not allowed to sort of do it annoyingly and on every move and adjust your opponent's pieces and your pieces. We had one guy who used to do this at the club, where literally every move he would touch like 7 or 8 pieces. I adjust. Do not put up with this. You need to call these people out, because they're obviously doing it to annoy you and throw you off your game, and you should not have to put up with it. So again, call the TD, otherwise they're not going to stop. Because the reason these people do this a lot of times is because no one says anything. If they see that every time they do it, people are going to say something, hopefully they'll stop doing it. But that's certainly a big one. Now, another thing I've seen is players who deliberately will not be clear about what square they're putting a piece on. For example, the most common example probably is when they move a pawn from its initial position, they'll put it between 2 squares. In other words, you don't know if they're moving it 1 square or 2 squares, or they'll put it slightly past the line between the 2 squares, but it's really frustrating. Now, this isn't the sort of thing where I expect it to be exactly, aesthetically in the middle of the square, but it should be clear what the destination square is. But what they'll do is, and again, especially with pawns, they'll kind of put it between squares. And what I usually say is, you need to put that on a square. Which square is that on? And usually that gets them to stop. Now, there was another player at the club, an older gentleman who used to come to the club all the time. A young kid was doing this against him, and he was totally calling him out because he said it once politely to stop, and he kept doing it. And finally, we had to jump in, then it stopped. But this is something that some players do. I don't know if they're just trying to be annoying or get in their opponent's head, but they will deliberately not put the piece on a specific square, like sort of between squares. I don't know. Maybe they think so that they can say, oh, no, I meant to put it on this square. I don't know. It's very strange, but you should not have to put up with that. The other thing you see regarding pieces is slamming of the pieces. I've mentioned this before in previous episodes, but what I notice, and this is actually more with adults than kids, at least in my experience, players will get frustrated and then they start slamming the pieces. When that happens, I usually make a comment to diffuse it. Like I'll say something like, you're trying to like break the table or something. I'll say, you don't need to slam the piece. And then usually they stop. But I think the reason they do it, it's sort of a way of them saying like, ha, gotcha, or they're just to make you think that, even though most of the time when they make a move and slam the piece, the move is usually completely innocuous and harmless. It's more a representation of the frustration that they feel in a worse position. But the slamming of the pieces, you see it all the time. And again, not putting a piece clearly on a square. Another big pet peeve of mine, you do see these things. And again, you need to say something to your opponent. And, as you can see the pattern here, if that doesn't work, you need to call the TD over because you should not have to deal with that. All right. The next behavior is sort of funny and annoying at the same time. It really depends on whether it bothers you and on who your opponent is. Because like I said, it can be funny, but it can be annoying. These are the people I call the acknowledgers. You ever play an acknowledger? This is where every time you make a move, especially if it's a good move, they have to like acknowledge it or validate it. So you'll make a good move and it's like, yep, and then, they'll move again and then you'll make another good move in response to them. Yep, But, they do this like every move. Now, again, it can be funny, but it can also drive you crazy. So, if you need to say something like, you don't need to react on every move, I'd appreciate it. Usually they stop, but it depends. I mean, there's a couple guys who do this at the club. I find it almost funny, but depending on who your opponent is, like I said, it can be annoying. Or they'll nod their head, like you'll make a good move and it's like, They just keep nodding, right? These nodders or acknowledgers. Now, the other side of that, now this one is definitely annoying. This one is never funny, are the sighers, not S-I-R-E, S-I-G-H-E-R-S. Is that how you spell it? The sighers. This is where your opponent's in a tough position or he's losing and you're sort of slowly grinding him. He has no counterplay. And every time you make a move, they like sigh, but like really visibly and really loud. So you'll make a move. It's, oh, right. And they sigh, oh, all right. And then you make another move again. Oh, so again, you got to say something, stop sighing. Right? It's like if you do it once, I get it, but on every move, it's just incredibly annoying. But, we have those, so you have your acknowledgers and your sighers. Now let's move on to something that for me is definitely one of the most annoying things, which is the hand hovering. And there's going to be a lot of alliteration for this section. The hand hovering, or I guess if you do that, you would be a hand hoverer. And if you like doing it, I guess you're a happy hand hoverer. You ever play one of these people, the people with the hand hover? Now, there's two reasons they usually do it, the hand hover. So let's take the first one. The first one is they do it while they're thinking. Now, in a sense, you could say that's good because if they're hovering their hand while thinking, that means they're reaching for a piece without having fully decided what to do, which is not good. Because, what I always say in my philosophy, you don't want to start reaching for pieces until you know exactly what you're going to play. You should sit on your hands until unless you're in time pressure. So in a sense, you could say it's good because they might be a little hesitant. But the reason I don't like the hand hover, it's just very annoying. It blocks the board. So if they're really sticking their hand out and really holding it there, like a statue, I'll just say, can you please move your hand until you're ready to move? If it's bothering you. Now, it may not bother you. As I'm going to say at the end when I conclude all this, you do kind of have to pick your battles. If it doesn't bother you, then don't worry about it. But if like me, if a very prolonged hand hover over the board is distracting to you, you should say something. All right. But it's a habit some people have. And then the second thing, or the second type of hand hover, and this is a big one, is the hand hover draw offer, where they say, I offer a draw, and then they stick their hand out, and it's almost like they're waiting for you to take it. Now, when someone does that to me, I actually say right away, you need to take your hand away from my face. I'll think about your draw offer. Let me consider it, but please put your hand down. Because you can't say, I offer a draw, and stick your hand out and sort of force your opponent into accepting. It doesn't work that way. That's completely improper. You're supposed to make your move, offer the draw, hit your clock. But this is something that you see. Let's say I offer a draw and they stick their hand out. It's like, sorry, put your hand down, please. I'm going to think about it. But that's something that you shouldn't be sort of pressured into doing. All right. And what that's actually telling you is that you shouldn't take the draw, because by having your opponent stick his hand out, that means he really wants it and he's probably desperate and he thinks he has a worse position. So the hand hover draw offer should be assigned to you not to take the draw, in addition to being extremely annoying. And just a distinction here, I'm not referring to a draw offer where the person sort of sticks his hand out in a friendly way, like for a few seconds in front of them. That's normal. That happens all the time, and that's cool. What I'm talking about is like a full throttle, overt hand hover draw offer where like they're really kind of sticking it in your face in an obnoxious way. That's what I'm referring to. Because some people might say, well, wait a minute, to offer to shake hands with a draw offer, isn't that normal? Yes, it is. But as I said, that's kind of if they just hold their hand in front of them, do it in kind of a friendly way. But if they're really kind of forcing it upon you, that's what I'm referring to. So I just wanted to make that distinction. To wrap this up, we looked at a number of annoying and distracting behaviors. Now, this is not meant to be an exhaustive list of every single behavior that you could possibly face. I'm sure many of you have faced other behaviors that didn't make the cut, that I didn't mention. That might actually be a good Twitter post now that I'm thinking about it. Maybe when I post for this episode, I'll put something like, what's the most annoying behavior that you've had to face? Because I'm curious what other ones there might be that I didn't mention. Because as I said, this was in like a formal list. So maybe we can have a conversation about that. And ultimately, with everything I mentioned, you need to pick your battles. Like I might have mentioned something that I find annoying, but it may not bother you. Or maybe sometimes it bothers you and sometimes it doesn't, depending on your opponent. I would tell you this. If it's not affecting your game, if it doesn't bother you, fine, play on. But if your opponent's behavior is bothering you and is affecting your game, you need to say something. All right? Say something to the opponent. Many times that's enough. But if not, you need to pause your clock and call the TD over. Chess tournaments are supposed to be a fun, engaging experience. And when someone's ruining it for you because of his or her behavior, you need to say something, all right? Because it is the royal game. We do need to preserve the sanctity of the tournament hall, and you shouldn't have to put up with that, all right? As I said, many of these entry fees are expensive. You're spending a lot of time. You're sitting there for hours. You should not have to suffer in silence, which is the worst thing you can do. This is important stuff to talk about because, again, your tournament success has a lot to do with how well you handle the situation itself and not so much chess theory and chess knowledge. A lot of players are very good with the chess theory and chess knowledge, but their ratings don't catch up to that because they're just not good at handling the tournament situation. So it's something to think about. As always, I really appreciate you listening, and I hope you win your next game. Have a great day.